السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أهلا وسهلا بكم في البث 58، حيث أشارككم دراستي الفلسفية الكلامية القانونية العلمانية البتنجانية. ونحن الآن في صدد دراسة نظرية المعرفة أو أصول العلم، والفصل الأول من كتاب نظرية المعرفة الإسلامية، وهو عن الفارابي. دعونا نسمع ماذا يقول الأستاذ أنتوني روبرت بوث عن الفارابي. ولكني لست مهتم أوي يلا مش هنخسر حاجة، مش والفصل مش طويل هيا بنا نسمع.
What did the famous Islamic philosopher Abu Nar al-Farabi, d. 339-950, think the relationship between philosophy and theology is? The received interpretation is that he thought philosophy is epistemically superior to theology. That the latter operates only at the level of rhetoric and dialectics, and that the former deals with demonstrative proof, such that only the philosophers can attain proper certainty, on an Aristotelian understanding of it, see below. The difference between theology and philosophy on this account is that theology cannot yield certainty, whereas philosophy can. This interpretation was first associated with Leo Strauss and his school of interpretation. One sees this interpretation, for instance, in the work, Now goes way beyond that, such that one sees it in less explicitly Straussian and canonical interpreters writing in English, often in introductory. I will use theology commentaries, such as Peter Adamson, Deborah Black, Majid Fakhri, and Ian Netton. In this chapter, I seek to cast some doubt as to whether Al-Farabi really thought that there was such a sharp distinction between theology and philosophy. Let me start this section by first saying what I mean by epistemically superior and then move on to explain why people attribute this view to Al-Farabi. I will then propose an alternative interpretation, and how it bears on his account of the relationship between philosophy and theology, proposing that the importance of understanding and non-accidentality in his account has the following two corollaries. Only prophetic knowledge can yield full certainty, and the difference between philosophy and theology cannot be about which of the two grants full certainty. I then attempt to explain away the textual evidence that scholars marshal in favor of the received view. The received view of Al-Farabi on philosophy versus theology.
اللي أنا أتوقع إن هو يقوله إن هو لا ينتقد علم الكلام بقدر أنه ينتقد المتكلمين. فاهمين الفرق؟ مين المتكلمين في زمن الفارابي؟ في زمن الفارابي المتكلمين هم المعتزلة. فهو بينتقد المعتزلة، مش بينتقد علم الكلام. ما هو الفارابي في حد ذاته متكلم. دي يعني أظن ده اللي هيقوله يعني، بس هنشوف.
It is uncontroversial that Al-Farabi was keenly interested in logic, logic here being understood to comprise epistemology as well as the practices of demonstration, dialectics, and rhetoric. Al-Farabi wrote several works on these matters, including Conditions of Certitude, Shari al-Yaqin, and Epitome of the Posterior Analytics. Kitab al-Burhan. Aristotle's Posterior Analytics was well known among Muslim scholars. This latter work is a work of metalogic, which gives us an account of what the most certain and best kind of knowledge is, what Aristotle terms demonstrative proof. We know a proposition demonstratively. According to Aristotle, when we know that proposition via a deductively sound syllogism, whose middle term is either a first principle or derived from a first principle, which explains why the conclusion is true. First principles are principles that are somehow directly grasped and cannot be derived from other principles or sets of propositions. While this demand looks in keeping with foundationalist epistemologies, the demand that these principles be explanatory does not. This might already make Aristotle's theory of knowledge difficult to place within contemporary classification of theories of knowledge. I will come back to this point later. Al-Farabi seems to accept this definition of demonstrative proof. However, as I will explain later, he does raise some interesting questions. 2. For example, Fakhri, Al-Farabi, for it, and almost all of his works contain mention of this notion. Philosophy done correctly, for Al-Farabi, ought to grant us such demonstrative proof and, so the thought goes for the received interpretation, will yield us certainty. Aside from being well known as a logician, Al-Farabi is also known to be the first of the philosophers to have grappled with the philosophical issues attendant to a revealed religion. Especially in the context of a mutazil, what I call evidentialist and some people call rationalist, conception of doxastic normativity, whereby one ought to believe what is in the Quran only because the truth of what is in the Quran can be demonstrated on the basis of independent evidence. This accords with mutazil general realism on ethical matters and emphasis on God's justice. There are normative facts that determine what we ought to believe and how we ought to behave, and God, who is just, rewards and punishes us in virtue of, and consistently with, those facts. Al-Kendi, DCA 259/873, who is often credited with having kick-started the falsafa tradition, subscribed to a sort of value monism about epistemic value. What holds unique epistemic value is the truth is what uniquely governs what we ought to believe, pace the Mutazila. This leads directly, for him, to an account of the relationship between religion and reason, prophecy, and philosophy. What is in the Quran ought to be believed because it is true and, to the extent that philosophy uncovers anything that is true, it cannot possibly be in contradiction to it. As I have argued in Islamic philosophy and the ethics of belief. This also commits Al-Kendi to a sort of evidentialism, which here is compatible with epistemological foundationalism as it is just the view that there can be no non-epistemic reasons for belief. For Al-Kendi, this had a direct result on what we should think is the relationship between theology and philosophy, that they are on an epistemic par. They are simply different paths to arrive at the same truth. One can get to the truth by studying and interpreting the Quran and Hadith, or one can get to the truth via independent reasoning, perhaps assisted by reading Plato and Aristotle. But since truth is the only thing of epistemic, and also ultimately religious, value, there is nothing to decide between each method. Each is as good as the other, and it does not even matter if one gets you to your destination quicker than the next. Speed is irrelevant, only truth is relevant. But this of course raises the issue, which Al-Farabi picks up on, of what the unique epistemic purpose of prophecy is, if all we need is to engage our rational faculties to discover the truth. Why did God need to send us a Quran? Writing about the contemporaries of Al-Farabi, Abu Bakr al-Razi 313/925 and Abu al-Qasim al-Kab 319/931, Peter Adamson has remarked. This material illustrates a trap into which not just al-Kab, but all Mutazilites, were in danger of falling. By putting so much emphasis on the autonomy of reason, especially in the ethical sphere, they were in danger of leaving no room for prophecy. The standing view regarding Al-Farabi is that he holds there to be a difference in the epistemic status of beliefs at which one arrives through reason and those at which one arrives through consulting and studying prophecy, as per the practices of the theologians. Only through demonstrative proof, that is, philosophy, can one attain full certainty. One might attain a level of certainty through theology, but theology is at best concerned with rhetoric and dialectics. This is directly related to the issue of the epistemic uniqueness of prophecy. Al-Farabi admits that not everyone will have the ability to harness the independent power of reason, so that a just God will perforce have given them some other means to attain knowledge of him. Thus, God sends down a Quran, which presents the truth through allegories and symbols, as well as in context, for everyone, and not just a cognitive elect, to be able to understand. This means that for Al-Farabi there was a differential in the normative demands made on belief. If one is a member of the epistemic elite, one ought to believe on the basis of epistemic reason alone. If not, one can believe for non-epistemic reasons such as on the basis of allegory. I think this position is usefully called Islamic moderate evidentialism. Hence, the supposed epistemic superiority granted to philosophy as against theology is that the former, not the latter, provides complete certainty. It is advantageous, so claims Al-Farabi, since it makes one immune to being persuaded by errant sophistry, keeping one tethered to the truth, as Plato's famous statues of Daedalus in the Meno need to be. So why do people think that Al-Farabi held this view? I think there are at least 4 things that can be brought to bear on this. 1. What he says about Aristotle's idea regarding metaphysics as first philosophy. 2. Explicit remarks made about the inferiority of religion in his The Book of Religion. 3. Remarks he makes in a political context about happiness being unavailable to those who do not live in a city run by philosophers, happiness being here knowledge. 4. An unappreciative account of Kalam given in his The Enumeration of the Sciences. Let me go through each briefly in turn. Regarding 1. In his short work on Aristotle's Metaphysics, he complains about how people have misunderstood Aristotle in thinking that first philosophy must be theology because God is the unmoved mover, or first cause, in Aristotle's system. That is, it is a mistake to infer, as had Al-Kendi, that because the first cause is God and that first philosophy, that is, a philosophy that looks into what is most fundamental, must look to what is God, and since that is a theological enterprise, first philosophy must be theology. Al-Farabi's claim here is that first philosophy must look at all the most primary things, God being one of them, but so also first principles, like the law of non-contradiction. Regarding 2, we find, in his Book of Religion, the following passage directly addressing the relationship between religion and philosophy. Therefore, the 2 parts of which religion consists are subordinate to philosophy. For something is said to be a part of a science or to be subordinate to a science in 1 or 2 ways. Either the demonstrative proofs of what is assumed in it without demonstrative proofs occur in that science, or the science comprising the universals is the one that gives the reasons for the particular subordinate. Therefore, the 2 parts of which religion consists are subordinate to philosophy. For something is said to be a part of a science or to be subordinate to a science in 1 or 2 ways. Either the demonstrative proofs of what is assumed in it without demonstrative proofs occur in that science, or the science comprising the universals is the one that gives the reasons for the particular subordinate to it. Since it is the theoretical part of philosophy that gives demonstrative proofs for the theoretical part of religion, it is philosophy, then, that gives the demonstrative proofs of what virtuous religion encompasses. This looks like clear textual evidence for the position which we have earlier called Islamic moderate evidentialism. Only philosophy gives one demonstrative proof, and the point of religion is to give a symbolic form to these truths for the purposes of the public. This accords well with Al-Farabi's account of how prophecy works. Building on the work of Al-Kendi on prophetic dreams, he takes the prophetic mind to be different from the ordinary human mind, not in so much that it has a superior intellect, but in having a more developed faculty of imagination. When this human mind comes to grasp all the intelligibles from the active intellect, a superhuman intelligence that permanently thinks all the intelligibles, and comes to inhabit a state Al-Farabi calls the acquired intellect. An emanation occurs from the active intellect into this stronger imagination. The active intellect then does its work in the faculty of the imagination. Hence, the kind of intellectual seeing that we feel when, for instance, we intuit the law of non-contradiction, or that Gettier cases are not cases of knowledge, now takes on, for the prophet, a symbolic, allegorical form. This, importantly, allows the prophet to see all the intelligibles at once and to see the connection between them. I will come back to that point later, which I think is extremely important. But this leads Al-Farabi to claim that the prophet is the ideal political leader, since he is able to explain the fundamental truths of the universe in a way that everyone can understand, and this, as he tells us in the Book of Religion, is really the point of Scripture. This all dovetails with the point as regards 3. It seems that in the political regime, the supreme ruler of a perfect state is both a philosopher and a prophet. But the prophet ultimately finds justification for his prophecy in philosophy. As Charles Butterworth has put it, all that is said and 10 C. Al-Kendi, on the quiddity of sleep and dreams. 11 For instance, as Ceylon has put it, The answer Al-Farabi offers to this question is that the intelligibles take on various imaginary shapes in the faculty of representation, but these skills would, what, done by the supreme ruler finds justification in philosophy, and religion thus depends on philosophy, theoretical as well as practical. What the prophet adds to philosophy qua prophet are his rhetorical and dialectical skills, such that he may direct them human beings towards happiness. But these skills would be useless without being grounded in philosophical knowledge. Further, Al-Farabi tells us that happiness is not possible for anyone unless they live in a city that is run by philosophers. And in his The Attainment of Happiness he tells us, presumably following Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, that human happiness is what happens when we come to realize our intellectual potential and come to have an acquired intellect, connecting to the active intellect and, therefore, in some sense transcending our bodily, earthly existences. Finally, as regards, in his The Enumeration of the Sciences, Al-Farabi identifies 3 different types of Kalam theologian. Theologians who think there is really no place for independent reason in understanding scripture and that we should just accept it on the basis of miracles, and then at face value. 2. Theologians who take a more critical attitude than denoted in, presumably the Mu'tazila, and who are willing to use reason to try to iron out apparent textual contradictions in scripture. 3. Theologians who are just interested in interreligious debate and exposing the internal contradictions of rival religions. He is most dismissive of those in group 3, whom he claims to engage in cheap tricks to win arguments. He describes the practitioners of this group to be in arguing as if in a state of war and so only interested in winning the argument, precisely how Plato had characterized the sophists. But for Al-Farabi all of the types of theologian presented here are in a kind of state of self-deception, they act as if they had gained the warrant for certainty in their claims when really they were at most engaged in dialectics and rhetoric. This is because, engages in mere taqlid, following without rational evidence, 2, in dialectics and, 3, in rhetoric, thus none arrive at the thing that can ground proper certainty, demonstrative proof. Only the philosopher can do that. This coheres with what Al-Farabi says in his Epitome of the Posterior Analytics, where he calls the sort of assent given by the Mu'tazila as the most remote from certainty and where both dialectics and rhetoric are said to yield merely accidental certainty. Thus, we have a picture in which Al-Farabi has it that philosophy is superior to theology, because it is only through philosophy that one can achieve warranted certainty. Since the unique function of scripture is to educate the masses through symbols, theology, alone, can at best only achieve sub-demonstrative knowledge via dialectical and rhetorical argument. I think this picture, however, is not quite accurate. I will now proceed with providing an alternative interpretation, first on what his account of certainty involves, contrasting it to the views of Deborah Black, and second on what that means for the relationship between philosophy and theory. I will then move on to explain away the textual evidence for the received view, that is, explain why it does not refute my purported interpretation. A new interpretation. What I think is missing in the received interpretation is a more nuanced view regarding Al-Farabi's idea of what absolute, and non-absolute, certainty comprises. In this section, therefore, I try to provide this alternative view and then move on, in the next section, to discuss what this means for his account of the relationship between philosophy and theology. What I take to unify and ground everything that I am about to say about these things is his critique of taqlid. That is, not just the kind of theologian who thinks we should unquestioningly accept everything in scripture, but also those who seek mere knowledge of discrete, individual truths, even when they are necessary, timeless truths, are engaged in a kind of taqlid. To attain proper certainty we need more than that. We need to understand these truths. In Al-Farabi's short, but very important work, The Conditions of Certitude, he presents 6 conditions, or 6 differentia, for achieving proper certainty. Absolute certainty is, 1, to believe of something that it is thus or not thus, 2, to agree that it corresponds and is not opposed to the existence of the thing externally, 3, to know that it corresponds to it. Absolute certainty is, 1, to believe of something that it is thus or not thus, 2, to agree that it corresponds and is not opposed to the existence of the thing externally, 3, to know that it corresponds to it, and, 4, not possible that it not correspond to it or that it be opposed to it, and, further, 5, that there does not exist anything opposed to it at any time, 6, and that all of this does not happen accidentally, but essentially. Deborah Black has, in the English-speaking world at least, been the foremost interpreter of this text. She has identified a number of different, interesting features of this account, although her interpretation is coherent with the received interpretation on the putative primacy of philosophy over theology. The 3 most important features I think she has identified are explained briefly below under the headings of 1, the gradability of certainty, 2, the internalist-externalist tension, and 3, the superfluity of the 6th condition. 1, the gradability of certainty. Black has characterized Al-Farabi's central contribution to be the idea that there is a gradability of certainty, such that forms of certainty exist but are not absolute. This idea, with which I very much agree, is that one can still maintain a level of warranted certainty even when one is not absolutely certain. I think this sort of neo-Pyrrhonist position is extremely fruitful and helps steer an excellent middle course between skepticism and infallibilism, which even helps resolve many issues in political philosophy. What I think she misses is that he has here laid the foundation for us to realize that the philosopher's state of certainty is to the prophet's state of certainty what the ordinary humans is to the philosophers. Black is emphatic that the gradability of certainty does not undermine the overall position I call Islamic moderate evidentialism, nor its attendant idea that only philosophy, and not theology, can yield certainty. Here is Black. The main result of his reflection seems to have been that our everyday, pre-philosophical intuitions about knowledge and certitude are not entirely groundless. This is not to say that Farabi intended in any way to rehabilitate or legitimize the epistemic role of those forms of knowledge he would have identified as dialectical, rhetorical, or poetic, at least not for the philosophers as such. Farabi remains an epistemological elitist, like most of the philosophers in his tradition. 21 Al-Farabi. I will shortly attempt to present a slightly alternative picture to this, one where proper certainty cannot be achieved where there exists no unity of the theoretical virtues with the more practical virtues, as executed in dialectical and rhetorical reasoning. 2. The internalist-externalist tension. According to Black, there exists a central tension in Al-Farabi's account between what is called in contemporary epistemology a KK condition, an internalist, knowing that one knows condition, see condition 3 above, and a certain externalism, where knowing how or whether one knows first principles is not required. Black has thought that conditions 4 and 5 are externalists since the subject is not required to know that they obtain so long as they do obtain. About this tension, Black has said, this tension is perhaps one of the most intractable within the Farabian theory, and one that is difficult to resolve without abandoning some fundamental tenet of Aristotelian epistemology. It is a tension that, together with their many insights and innovations, Farabi's logical treatises were to bequeath to the later philosopher for whom he was the second teacher. As regards our knowledge of first principles, and why his account is a kind of externalist one, Black has drawn particularly on his epitome of the posterior analytics. What Farabi does say is that we have no conscious awareness of when we acquired knowledge of these intelligibles, and we can recall no time when we did not know them. Farabi goes on to insist that the question of their origin is of no concern to the logician. And she has cited the following passage from Al-Farabi to corroborate her view. The fact that we are ignorant of the manner of their attainment does not cause our certainty in them to cease. Nor does it diminish or impede us from composing a syllogism from them which causes certainty for us as a necessary entailment from them. My own view, which I will explain shortly, is that Al-Farabi thinks that most of us on our own, individually, will be ignorant of how we attain first principles and so will fall short of absolute certainty. This is how he can resolve the tension. Working on our own, we cannot meet the KK requirement for absolute certainty but, consistent with the quote above, this does not mean that we cannot achieve absolute certainty, since we can achieve it working as a collective. Absolute certainty, I think, is meant to be reserved solely for the prophet individually, or, at times, when the human collective is working in proper harmony. I think that this is the purpose of his final condition, which is important on my account. 3. The superfluity of the sixth condition. Black has considered that the kind of accidentality that the sixth condition is meant to rule out has already been ruled out by the other conditions, especially the third. As she has put it, it seems we must conclude that Farabi's sixth condition is superfluous, and that it ultimately collapses into the other conditions, in particular the third. However, I think that the accidentality that condition 3, what Black calls the knowledge condition, rules out is of a kind different from the accidentality that is meant to be ruled out by the final condition. I think this final condition is meant to rule out what contemporary epistemologists call evidential luck, luck that one has evidence, which they distinguish from veridic luck, luck that S's belief that P is true given S's evidence. The contemporary consensus is that evidential luck, but not veridic, is compatible with knowledge. Al-Farabi may agree with this, but I think he wants to insist instead that absolute certainty is incompatible even with evidential luck. This point is directly related to what Black thinks is a tension between the internalist and externalist requirements in Al-Farabi account, for it is true that we do not know how we come to intuit first principles such as the law of non-contradiction, and what it is that makes our intuitions, the working of nous, on such things reliable. It is this that in a way makes foundationalism appealing. At some point we just run out of explanation and hit bedrock. But there is already a 28 further tension here in Aristotle's definition of demonstration. His requirement for the middle terms of a syllogism to be explanatory, and so to involve understanding, looks at odds with our having a genuine grasp of first principles that does not involve an understanding of how it is that we come to know them. This is relevant to the question of whether there is evidential luck, our having the reliable evidence from rational intuition of first principles looks overly accidental without this concomitant understanding. I think Al-Farabi's account of certainty here, in fact, ingeniously resolves the tension rather than introducing one into Aristotelian epistemology. He thinks that, in order to satisfy conditions 1 to 5, we need not have ruled out such evidential luck, to require that would lead to severe skepticism. The KK condition which he stipulates, as in modern epistemology, requires the subject simply to know that one has evidence, not to understand why and how one has such evidence. That seems to be reasonable in ordinary cases of evidence. But when we are talking about our direct acquaintance with first principles, which looks mysterious, the requirement that we understand it does not look so unreasonable. Especially if we are trying to define an ideal state of perfect certainty, as he is trying to do. However, this raises the following question: How could anyone possibly meet this requirement? I think that, while Al-Farabi does think the ordinary mortal can meet it to some extent, he resorts to Aristotle's De Anima where he thinks such an account is extant. But ultimately that account relies on the workings of the active intellect, which each of us, individually, cannot hope to grasp in toto. This is where his account of prophecy becomes most relevant. For recall that, for Al-Farabi, the prophet's special faculty of imagination enables him to grasp all the intelligibles at once, for all the necessary propositions are conformed with one another. And this is part of what gives him his special rhetorical and dialectical abilities. Thus, he not only has discrete parts of knowledge of first principles but, in seeing how they are all connected, truly understands them and so understands the active intellect. Thus, he also presumably understands how and why there came to be a need for there to be prophet and why then he has the evidence that he has. This is of a piece with Al-Farabi's Neoplatonism, where the further up in the emanationist chain one goes, the more unity one finds, until one arrives at that being which is defined by its oneness, God, that is, the first. Thus, for Al-Farabi, especially in his The Attainment of Happiness, we find human felicity defined in terms of grasping not just all the intelligibles but grasping how they are intimately connected. Even Peter Adamson, a major proponent of the received view, has conceded this. So now we know what Al-Farabi would like us to do, fully realize our potential for knowledge by working our way up from familiar things to genuinely primary things, and grasping all the sciences as one interlocking system. Philosophy and theology in harmony. As mentioned, Al-Farabi's Neoplatonism brings to the Aristotelian account of demonstration the idea that the more we see how things are interconnected, the better we get to know them. One has to then presume that this will be true of the virtues, too, such that the further up in the chain of emanation we go, the more unity of the virtues we find. Therefore, the prophet's more perfect state of certainty comes together with the state where the virtues are more unified. The virtues that make him the ideal political leader that we discussed, the capacity for rhetoric, dialectics, poetics, are unified. It is this unification that grants him his unique state of certainty, where he, unlike us, understands the why of the necessary propositions. As so only he, about the necessary propositions, meets this demand that Al-Farabi sets out. All demonstration proceeding from its principles combine two things, I mean they give an account of the thing's existence and of why it exists, all of them are demonstrations of both that the thing is and why it is. Thus, I think we need to slightly amend Black's previously quoted claim. This is not to say that Farabi intended in any way to rehabilitate or legitimize the epistemic role of those forms of knowledge he would have identified as dialectical, rhetorical, or poetic, at least not for the philosophers as such. 31 Adamson, Philosophy. The prophet, whom Al-Farabi often describes as a philosopher, has a perfected state of certainty that is a composite of dialectical, rhetorical, and poetic forms of knowledge as well as those identified as demonstrative. While it is true that Al-Farabi does not wish to rehabilitate the epistemic role of the more practical forms of knowledge as modes of knowledge working alone, my interpretation does very much complicate the traditional picture of what he thinks about the relationship between philosopher and theologian, and between reason and religion. First of all, his solution to the epistemic uniqueness problem gains a new, and richer, dimension under this interpretation. What is different about prophetic and non-prophetic knowledge is the mode in which their objects are grasped. The prophet knows no different propositions than any other human can independently come to know, but he understands them better than any human, because he can grasp them all together. Thus, one can test the legitimacy of prophecy against reason. Without rendering the former obsolete, everything in it can be individually independently verified, but it contains a vision of how the fundamental truths of the world hang together, which is beyond any other human capacity. Thus, while prophecy does contain a pedagogical function, it is not through it alone that it is epistemically unique. This means, second, that neither the philosopher nor the theologian, thought of as someone skilled in dialectics, rhetoric, and poetics via the use of the faculty of the imagination, can attain absolute certainty. This is because neither of them, alone, can attain such a holistic understanding. While it may be true that philosophical knowledge, in dealing with necessary and timeless propositions, may get the philosopher to a level of certainty above that of the theologian, each alone cannot attain absolute certainty. Therefore, the difference between them cannot be about which of the two can attain this. I think Al-Farabi's ultimate point is that, to attain full certainty, the philosopher and theologian need to work together, the faculty of nous needs to work with the faculty of the imagination. I think this is made clear in his more political writings when he tells us that the prophet's state of perfection, where the virtues are unified, itself imitating the first, should be emulated like the different parts of a state working together in harmony. Those which are from the very outset provided with all the essentials of their existence are made to imitate the first, cause, and its. 35 Furthermore, aim from their very outset, and hence enjoy eternal bliss and hold the highest ranks. But those which are not provided from the outset with all the essentials of their existence, are provided with a faculty by which they move toward the expected attainment of those essentials and will then be able to follow the aim of the first, cause. The excellent city ought to be arranged in the same way, all its parts ought to imitate in their actions the aim of their first ruler according to their rank. It is thus only when the philosopher and theologian work together that we can attain proper happiness in this world by fully realizing our potential for full-on, absolute certainty. Such an account is not as elitist or disparaging against the theologians as the received view would have it. But what about the textual evidence that supports the received view? In the next section, I show how the interpretation just canvas can manage it. Another way of reading the textual evidence. To recapitulate, recall the 4 reasons I presented for the traditional interpretation of Al-Farabi's take on philosophy versus theology. 1. What he says about Aristotle's idea of metaphysics as first philosophy. 2. Explicit remarks made about the. Given the discussion in the last section, let me start with addressing. 3. I think the remarks about the city being run by philosophers are extremely misleading in that they may lead us to believe that he is talking about philosophers in a solely secular sense. It is rather uncontroversial that he thinks that, in the ideal city, the prophet is the ideal political leader. And he is explicit that the prophet is, among other things, a philosopher, so let it be clear to you that the idea of the philosopher, supreme ruler. 36 Al-Farabi, prince, legislator, and imam is but a single idea. He is instructing us here that the idea of a philosopher in the context of political leadership is not to be taken in the Platonic sense, since that sense is divorced from the idea of an imam. Plato himself had advocated for the need of rhetoric to ensure the harmony of the polis. But it is unclear whether his philosopher, skilled only in theory, can really be the best person to dispatch the noble myths which Plato himself thinks are necessary. Al-Farabi looks here to be improving on Plato's vision, with an amended conception of the philosopher as someone in whom all the virtues are unified. This unification of the virtues allows him to attain a perfect state of certainty and thus have perfect powers of persuasion, using dialectics, rhetoric, poetics. It is true that the pressing political question for Al-Farabi concerns what we are to do, politically, when we live in a time where there is no prophet, namely, for the vast majority of humankind. Here again he is clear that we are to attempt to emulate as much as we can the state of the prophet, that is, a state wherein the virtues are unified. But since in the state of unified perfection of the prophet the virtues are not in any hierarchy, it is not reason in the harmonious individual human soul that governs the other parts as per in Plato. Rather, it is the imaginative faculty in the prophet that allows him to grasp all the intelligibles at once and, therefore, to understand them. We can then reasonably infer from this that, when there is no prophet, it is not automatically the philosophers, qua non-prophets, who should rule and ensure that we are happy. Rather, human happiness is achieved when our virtues, dispersed and distributed among us, are put together again, and we need to work together as a collective to achieve this. This is what he means with his claim about humans not being able to be happy outside of a collective. This is related, I think, to the answer with respect to point 1. The ultimate epistemic state for Al-Farabi is absolute certainty. It is only when we reach the state that we fully realize our cognitive potential. Yet, in order to do this we need to apprehend all the intelligibles qua part of an interlocking system, Pace Adamson, and to do this we need the practical and rhetorical ability given through the imagination. Thus, while it is true that first philosophy involves the study of more than just God, such that it is not merely theology, it is also of a different kind of philosophy for Al-Farabi than that envisaged by Plato and Aristotle. It is a fusion of theology, rhetoric, dialectics, poetics, and that kind of traditional philosophy, where we merely arrive at theoretical knowledge of necessary propositions as individuals, through a demonstrative proof. With this in mind, his remarks about the inferiority of religion in his The Book of Religion, as per point 2 above, should then not be taken to denote any kind of substantive inferiority. Rather, the point he makes in such passages is merely formal when we conceive of the discipline of theology as the discipline that allows us to attain understanding as well as knowledge. That is, we cannot understand things that we do not know. Without knowledge, the understanding would be blind. We can take that to be the meaning behind the remark that the demonstrative proofs of what is assumed in it without demonstrative proofs occur in that science. The science of the understanding assumes that things that are the object of the understanding are known, so are the subject of demonstrative proof, and it cannot itself give us such proofs. It is only in that sense that theology is subordinate to philosophy. Philosophy can lead us to knowledge of individual propositions and do so without theology, but in order for us to attain full certainty, we will require both. Philosophy working on its own would be a mutilated philosophy. When the theoretical sciences are isolated and their possessor does not have the faculty for exploiting them for the benefit of others, they are defective philosophy. To be a truly perfect philosopher one has to possess both the theoretical sciences and the faculty for exploiting them for the benefit of all others. Finally, it looks like the account of Callum that is offered in the enumeration of the sciences is merely a descriptive and not a normative account. That is, Al-Farabi is telling us what as a matter of historical fact, in his view, were the practices of the Mu'tazila during his time. What he is ultimately getting at, I think, is that they think they can carry out their enterprise alone, without the need for philosophy, and that this really amounts to Tiqlid. But while philosophy can function to some degree more autonomously, in the final analysis so, too, it would be Tiqlid for it to operate alone, since it would be to act on mere knowledge without understanding. That may be good enough for us to simply get by in this world, but it is not good enough to secure ultimate happiness, in this life or the next. I have tried to argue that Al-Farabi's view about the relationship between philosophy and theology is a less combative and more collaborative one than has hitherto been proposed. In the account which I have sketched, however, one may wonder whether the notion of theology he puts on the table is the right conception of theology. This is a worry aside from the very broad conception of theology that I have employed in this chapter, as the thing that generates belief solely via a study of scripture or immersion in religion. For Al-Farabi, under this interpretation, what makes scripture epistemically unique is grounded in how the prophet understands the knowledge that is available to humanity. While we might prove prophecy in that it contains verifiable knowledge, the image of how all that knowledge hangs together is beyond any single one of us. One might then wonder whether that means Al-Farabi has obviated the possibility of rational choice between that prophetic vision of the world and a rival one that employs the same truths but differently understood and configured, perhaps a scientistic worldview. Yet, in a way that is the whole point behind his skepticism about human absolute certainty, as individuals, we can no more be fully certain about a scientistic worldview than we can about any other, provided each is based on verifiable truth. The measure of these worldviews will then lie in something beyond verifiable truth, and to say that is already to go beyond a contemporary scientistic outlook.
حسنا.
The measure of these worldviews will then lie in something beyond verifiable truth, and to say that is already to go beyond the contemporary. Butterworth, Charles, Al-Farabi's goal.
الآن ننتقل
This
إلى الفصل
chapter
الثاني.
2.
يعني تقريبا زي ما قلت، يعني هو الفارابي شايف إن الفيلسوف يعني في درجات من اليقين. عندك أعلى درجة النبي، بعد كده الفيلسوف، بعد كده المعتزلي، بعد كده العامي، يعني 4 درجات. وعلى ما يبدو لأن النبي أيا كان، يعني مش سيدنا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم تحديدا، النبي عموما هو أعلى درجة، هو الوحيد اللي عنده اليقين المطلق. المتكلم يعني المعتزلي قريب من اليقين هو أيضا، لأن هو بيحلل وبيدرس كلام النبي أو كلام الله عبر النبي من خلال النبي. فالفيلسوف اللي بيدرس الكونيات واليقينيات العامة الميتافيزيقية بدون الوحي، بالعقل المحض، بالبرهان العقلي، يعني هذا الفيلسوف كي يرتقي أكثر يحتاج إلى كلام المتكلم، يحتاج إلى النبي. من الآخر يعني الفيلسوف والمتكلم محتاجين يشتغلوا مع بعض علشان يوصلوا، مش يوصلوا، هم عمرهم ما يوصلوا للنبي، علشان يرتقوا. ما ينفعش المعتزلي يشتغل في فقاعة لوحده كده يقعد يدرس كلام النبي بس، وما ينفعش الفيلسوف يبقى في فقاعة برضه بعيد عن كلام النبي. يعني المنهج العقلاني الديني هو أفضل منهج، يعني من الآخر، يعني هو ده كلام الفارابي، وهو كلام منطقي، بس يعني ممكن يعاد صياغته، بدل يستخدم كلمة فيلسوف ومتكلم ممكن نقول اللاديني والشرعي. يعني في علماء لا دينيين وفي علماء شرعيين. بدل كلمة لا دينيين ممكن نقول يعني في علماء دنيويين وعلماء شرعيين محتاجين يعملوا معا. ما ينفعش الشرعي يهمل العلوم الدنيوية، وما ينفعش الدنيوي يهمل العلوم الشرعية، يجب أن يعملوا معا. الفصل الثاني: عن المذهب التجسيمي بقى، اللي هو بيسميه السني الأثري، بس هو مش سني ولا أثري حسب تقسيمنا يعني أو تعريفنا، يعني هو هو المذهب التشبيهي التجسيمي يعني. يبدأ.
The Zaydi theologian Ibn al-Murda, d. 840/1436, in his biographical dictionary of the Mu'tazils relates an encounter between the 8th century theologian Yam ibn Afun, d. 128/746, and the Samaniyya. The Samaniyya were probably a group of Buddhists, and in this story their empiricism grounds skepticism about the existence of God. The Samaniyya ask Yam whether he knows God by any of the 5 senses. Yam replies that he does not. Hence, the Samaniyya conclude that Yam's God is unknown. Yam then consults with Will ibn Aa with Makron, d. 131/748-49, the putative founder of the Mu'tazils, and Will tells Yam to posit a 6th source of knowledge called inference, dalil. When the Samaniyya also deny that God's existence follows from inference, Will tells Yam to ask them how they distinguish between someone who is living and someone who is dead, and between someone who is rational and someone who is mad. The question confounds the Samaniyya, and they convert to Islam. Ibn al-Murda's account happily supports the inferential foundations of Mu'tazil Kalam theology and the Mu'tazil view that God is inaccessible to sense perception. Yam gains victory over the Samaniyya by demonstrating the existence of God through inference instead of sense perception. Ash'ari and Maturidi Kalam theologians agree with the Mu'tazils that God is not accessible to the human senses. The same applies to the falsafa of philosophers such as Avicenna, Ibn Sina, d. 428/1037. Knowledge of God may be found in reports of revelation or through rational inference but not by means of sense perception. The Mu'tazils and the philosophers prioritized rational inference. For Al-Ash'ari, d. 324/935, revelation was the grounds for the obligation to reason to knowledge of God. Al-Maturidi, d. 333/944, understood revelation and rational inference to be equally probative. The religious epistemologies of the Kalam theologians and Avicennan philosophers are intertwined with their ontologies and theologies. For all of them, God is imperceptible to the human senses, not merely because God is veiled or silent, but because God is ontologically distinct. God is not corporeal, located, or spatially extended. God is fundamentally not an empirical entity. This presents difficulty for Ash'aris and Maturidis who wish to interpret the Quranic verse, faces on that day radiant, looking at their Lord, Q75:22-23, to mean that God will be seen in the hereafter. The incorporeality of God prevents them from affirming that God will be seen in a literal sense. Thus, the vision must be interpreted to occur in a different way or without how, by laqav, that is, without understanding how it will occur. This chapter highlights a stream of traditionalist theology that opposes the Kalam and Avicennan conviction that God is inaccessible to the senses. The 9th century traditionist al-Darimi, DCA 281/894, the Anbal text al-Radal al-Zanatika wal Yamiyat, refutation of the heretics and the Yamiyat, attributed to Ahmad ibn Anbal, d. 241/855, and the Anbal theologian Ibn Taymiyyah, d. 728/1328, ground knowledge of God in prophetic revelation transmitted from generation to generation, and, in the case of Ibn Taymiyyah, rational inference as well. Revelation and inference are important for Ash'ari and Maturidi Kalam theologians, too, as noted above. However, these traditionalists break decisively with Kalam by expanding the epistemic range of sense perception to include God and maintaining that God is an empirical entity located above the world in a spatial sense. While God is not audible or visible to most people in this life, some prophets and messengers have seen and heard God, and everyone will be able to see God in the hereafter. The scope of sense perception is thus far greater than what either the Samaniyya, Kalam theologians, or Avicennan philosophers envision. It encompasses not only the physical and temporal world but also God himself. I call this strand of traditionalist theology spatialism because it interprets the Quran and the Sunnah to affirm that God is a spatially bounded existent located above the world. It differs markedly not only from Kalam and Falsafa but also from the anti-interpretive and non-cognitive strand of traditionalism found in the Anbal ibn Qudama, d. 620/1223, and earlier works such as the Creed of Ghulam Khalil, d. 275/888, often attributed to the Anbal al-Barbahari, d. 329/941. Whereas spatialists seek to articulate their theological interpretation in dialogue with opposing views. Non-cognitivists condemn all rational argument in theology and reject inquiry into the meaning of the theological content of the Quran and the Sunnah entirely. I will now examine al-Darimi, the Rad attributed to Ibn Anbal, and Ibn Taymiyyah in turn. While their opponents and dialogue partners vary, these traditionalists all share the spatialist theological conviction that God is an empirical entity. Al-Darimi. Abu Sa'd al-Darimi traveled widely in early life and studied with the leading traditionists of the day. He eventually settled in Herat in present-day Afghanistan and died there sometime between 280/893 and 282/895. At some point, al-Darimi wrote a refutation of the Yamas called al-Radal al-Yamiyat, the refutation of the Yamas. The book irritated an unnamed person who was sympathetic to the theologies of a Yamai-leaning Anaf scholar named Muhammad ibn Shajay al-Thalji, d. 266/879, and the Baghdadi Anaf intellectual Bishr al-Marisi, d. 219/833, who was accused of being a Yamai. Al-Darimi then responded to this unnamed opponent with a second treatise called Al-Naql al-Marisi, Refutation of al-Marisi. I will look only at this second treatise and focus particularly on the theological implications of its argument that God is accessible to the human senses. Early in Naql, al-Darimi criticizes his opponent for denying that God is perceptible by the five senses of touch, smell, taste, seeing and hearing. He counters that God is in fact audible and visible, and he supports this with Quranic verses stating that Moses heard God and that God will be seen in the hereafter. God spoke directly to Moses, Q4:164, and faces on that day radiant, looking at their Lord, Q75:22, 23. Al-Darimi explains further, God reports in his book that Moses perceived speech from him by means of his hearing, and this is one of the senses, according to both you and us. He is perceived in the hereafter by looking at him with the eyes, and this is the second sense. For good measure, he is perceived in. Al-Darimi explains further, God reports in his book that Moses perceived speech from him by means of his hearing, and this is one of the senses, according to both you and us. He is perceived in the hereafter by looking at him with the eyes, and this is the second sense. For good measure, Al-Darimi also quotes prophetic traditions affirming that God will be seen and heard in the hereafter. You will see your Lord on the day of resurrection as you see the sun and the moon clearly. You will have no difficulty seeing him, and God will speak to every one of you without a translator in between. The theological ramifications of regarding God as an empirical entity become clear a little later in Naql, where Al-Darimi explains that God is spatially bounded and located like other empirical objects. Al-Darimi attacks his Yamai opponent for claiming that God has no boundary, no extremity, Gaya, and no limit, Nihaya, and that God is not a thing, Shay. As far as Al-Darimi is concerned, such a God is nothing at all. Al-Darimi affirms instead that God has two boundaries. One is the boundary that only God knows. It is not to be imagined. It is simply to be believed, and knowledge of it entrusted to God. This is apparently God's upper boundary, although Al-Darimi does not say so explicitly. The second boundary, evidently God's lower boundary, is the boundary of God's place, Makan, over his throne above his heavens. Al-Darimi supports this with verses from the Quran such as the All-Merciful sat over the throne, Q20:5. Further along in Naql, Al-Darimi condemns the Yamai views that God is not over the throne like one body over another and that God is everywhere and not in one spot, apart from another. Al-Darimi avoids calling God a body, but he affirms that God is over his throne and distinct from creation by a clear gap, by Furja Bayana. God is therefore. This puts Al-Darimi, indeed in one spot apart from another. This puts Al-Darimi in something of a quandary before texts affirming that God is very close to us. He quotes the Quranic verse, there is no private conversation among three but that he is the fourth. Q58:7, and he alludes to the verse, we are closer to him than the jugular vein, Q50:16. For Al-Darimi, however, such texts do not mean that God is close to creatures in any sense of spatial proximity. Or, as Al-Darimi puts it more coarsely, God is not with everyone urinating, defecating, and copulating in their privies, toilets, and beds. God's nearness is instead God's full knowledge of all earthly affairs. God knows, sees, and hears everything from above the throne. Al-Darimi's Yamai opponent is also concerned to affirm that God is not contained and not encompassed. Al-Darimi agrees completely that nothing surrounds or encloses God. He asserts that there is nothing with God or above God, he is above the throne in the atmosphere of the upper extremity such that no other created thing is there with him and no heaven is above him. There is thus nothing at all above God's upper boundary. Al-Darimi's view of God easily evokes worries about anthropomorphism or assimilationism, tashbih, among those with kalam sensibilities. Al-Darimi is aware of this, and he responds that God's attributes and names are affirmed without inquiring into their modality, by la taqiyif, in accord with the Quranic verse, there is nothing like his likeness, Q42:11. However, this does not negate the fundamentally empirical and spatial character of God's existence in Al-Darimi's theology. A God accessible to the human senses on the epistemic level is ontologically a thing of the sort that is perceptible. God is a bounded thing that can be seen and heard. The Anbul-Rad. The Shfi traditionist Shams al-Din al-Tahabi, d. 748-1348, expressed doubts already in the 14th century about the attribution of the Anbul text known as al-Radal al-Zanatika wal Yamiyatu Ahmad ibn Anbul. Andrew McLaren has recently published a careful study of the provenance of the work, which shows that its first recension likely dates to the third quarter of the 10th century, about a century after the death of Ibn Anbul. This first recension provides a brief introduction and then recounts a version of Yam's encounter with the Samaniyya that differs substantially from that of Ibn al-Murda, which I presented at the outset of this study. The account in the Anbul-Rad begins with the Samaniyya challenging Yam to debate, with the loser to enter the winner's religion. The Samaniyya ask Yam whether he has seen, heard, smelled, touched, or sensed his God in any fashion. Yam replies that he has not. Thus, the Samaniyya wonder how he knows about God. This leaves Yam bewildered for 40 days. Then, he comes up with an argument that, according to the Anbul-Rad, is like the Christian contention that God is an invisible spirit who enters a creature to speak, as in the case of Jesus, son of Mary. Yam asks a Samani whether he has a spirit in him. The Samani says yes, and so Yam asks the Samani whether he has seen, heard, touched, or sensed that spirit in any way. The Samani says no, and then Yam counters, likewise with God. His face is not seen. His voice is not heard. His scent is not smelled. He is invisible to the eyes. He is in no one place to the exclusion of any other. To this point, the Anbul-Rad allows Yam to get the better of the Samaniyya in debate, as in Ibn al-Murda's account, but only by appeal to an argument at home in the rival religion of Christianity. Nothing is said about the Samaniyya converting to Islam. Instead, the Anbul-Rad condemns Yam for building his theology on Quranic verses of indeterminate meaning. Yam found 3 indeterminate, mutashabih, verses in the Quran. There is nothing like him, Q42:11, he is God in the heavens and in the earth, Q6:3, and eyes do not perceive him, but he perceives eyes, Q6:103, and he based the entirety of his theology on these verses. Moreover, so asserts the Anbul-Rad, the Yamas adopt a kind of negative theology. Among other things, God is everywhere and not in one place apart from another. God cannot speak. God is not seen. God has no limit, and God has no body. God is, in fact, different from anything that comes to our minds. The text then has Ahmad ibn Anbul declare that God is a thing, shay. The Yamas reply that God is a thing unlike things, and Ahmad retorts that a thing unlike things is nothing at all. The Yamas do not in fact believe in anything. The Anbul-Rad goes on to affirm that God is an empirical entity separate from the created world, much in the fashion of al-Darimi. God will be seen in paradise, as the Prophet said, you will surely see your Lord. God is in heaven and above the throne. God is not in human bodies, pigs, toilets, and unclean places. Rather, God surrounds the entirety of his creation without being in any of his creation. Like al-Darimi, the Anbul-Rad interprets the Quranic verse, there is no private conversation among 3 but that he is the 4th. Q58:7, to refer to God's knowledge, not to God's spatial proximity. It also interprets the verse, God is with you, Q57:4, to mean that God has knowledge of our affairs or that God defends, helps, and gives victory to us. Theologians in the Kalam tradition also interpret God's witness as God's knowledge, not because God is spatially distinct from everything in the world, but because God exists in a realm ontologically distinct from considerations of space. Ibn Taymiyyah. This brings us to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah upholds the same theological ontology as al-Darimi and the Anbul-Rad, and he agrees with them that God is audible, as when Moses heard God speak to him directly, and that God will be seen in the hereafter. Ibn Taymiyyah also maintains that God is located above the world and over the throne, far from all the filth and dirt found within the world. Moreover, the Quranic verse saying that God is with us wherever we are, Q57:4, means that God knows us and our circumstances. What makes Ibn Taymiyyah unique among spatialists is the rigor and thoroughness with which he engages not only Kalam but also the falsafa of Avicenna and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, d. 590. His aim is to expose errors in these intellectual currents and translate his traditionalist understanding of the Quran and the Sunnah into the idioms of his opponents, much as one would translate the Quran into other languages. It is not possible to discuss all relevant aspects of Ibn Taymiyyah's project here, and I will instead limit myself to showing how his understanding of the human natural constitution or innate nature, fira, a kind of epistemological faculty, fits together with his ontology in which God is an empirical entity. To clarify how this works, I will first examine Avicenna's notion of fira before contrasting it with Ibn Taymiyyah's. Avicenna discusses fira most fully in a treatment of estimative premises, Wamiyat, in the logic section of his Al-Najat, the Salvation. For Avicenna, the human fira consists of judgments of the intellect and the estimative faculty that cannot be doubted and that arise independently of societal beliefs and conventions. The undoubtable judgments of the intellect are true, but those of the estimative faculty are sometimes false. To make sense of this requires a diversion into Avicennan psychology. According to Avicenna, the estimative faculty, al-kawa al-wamiyat, or estimation, wam, is one of 5 internal senses, which, along with the 5 external senses of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell, are found in the animal soul common to both animals and humans. The inner senses process both the forms of sensible objects perceived by the external senses and the connotational attributes, man, of these objects of sense. Connotational attributes include things such as pleasantness, desirability, harmfulness, friendship, and hostility. These are things that the 5 external senses cannot perceive. Avicenna's stock example is that of a sheep perceiving a wolf. The sheep's internal sense, called the common sense, ismush tarak, receives the form of the wolf from the external senses, and this form is then stored in the imagination, kale. To the sheep, the wolf connotes danger, but the external senses cannot perceive this connotation. Perceiving the connotational attribute of the wolf's danger is the task of the sheep's estimative faculty. The estimation's perception of danger is direct. It is not a matter of experience. A sheep that only learns about the danger of wolves through experience may not live to put this experience to good use in later encounters with wolves. Once the estimation receives the connotational attributes, they are stored in the memory, dhikr. The 5th internal sense, the imaginative faculty, mutakayila, combines and separates forms and connotational attributes derived from the objects of sense. This occurs freely in dreams. Additionally, in humans, the intellect can take control of the imaginative faculty to work through problems visually in the mind. In the animal, the estimation takes control of the imaginative faculty to consider alternative courses of action, and this is as close as an animal gets to reason. In Avicenna's scheme, the estimative faculty is limited to the sensible world. Some of its judgments are therefore incorrect because they fail to 33 Ibn Sina, Kitab al, take account of the intellect. The estimation and the intellect do agree on primary judgments such as that 2 bodies cannot exist in the same place at the same time. However, the estimation goes against the intellect by judging that every existent is spatially extended, mutayz, and exists in a location, jihah. The estimation cannot judge otherwise because it is confined to objects of sense perception. Yet, according to Avicenna, the intellect indicates that some existents are not spatially extended, such as God and intellects. Avicenna emphasizes that the estimation is particularly powerful in marginalizing such truths of the intellect. Even if the intellect does show the falsehood of the estimation's judgments, the estimation persists in believing them. As we will see shortly, Ibn Taymiyyah diverges sharply from Avicenna on the veracity of the estimative faculty's judgments. I return now to Avicenna's account of Firah in the logic section of Al-Najat. Avicenna here defines the Firah as what one believes beyond the shadow of a doubt from perceiving the sensible world on its own. This perception is independent of what others think, and it comes before adoption of a particular creed or inclusion into a particular nation or political system. The judgments of the Firah do not constitute a priori knowledge since they arise from perceiving the world. They are rather the judgments that all human beings will form on the basis of sense perception when not subject to the influence of upbringing, education, and contact with the opinions of other people. Some judgments of the Firah are true, particularly those that derive from the Firah of the faculty that is called an intellect. The other aspect of the natural constitution, the Firah of the estimation, is the means by which the intellect gains judgments concerning the sensible realm. However, with regard to the immaterial realm, the Firah of the estimation lies, it does not tell the truth, because its epistemic remit is confined to objects of sense. Avicenna's Firah is thus conflicted, especially when it comes to the immaterial, intelligible world. This reflects the fundamental discontinuity in Avicenna's universe between the world of sense and the intelligible world, between the material and the immaterial, and between the corporeal and the incorporeal. The Firah of the estimation stubbornly forces the immaterial and incorporeal world into the mold of what is perceptible to the senses, and it will give no ground to the Firah of the intellect because it is incapable of doing so. The Firah of the intellect can only seek to overpower the estimation and narrow the scope of its impact. Ultimately, the full truth is found only in leaving the sensible world of the estimative faculty behind. Ibn Taymiyyah's view of the Firah is not conflicted in this fashion. However, it must first be said that the Firah for Ibn Taymiyyah is primarily an ethical or moral orientation. It is the natural human inclination to love and worship God. Then, beyond that, it also includes knowledge of God and the nature of reality. The Firah knows the principles of likeness and difference and logical axioms such as that a body cannot be in 2 places at the same time. Additionally, the Firah knows necessarily that every created thing needs a creator, and that everything originated needs an originator. Thus, there is no need for the kalam or philosophical proofs for God because the Firah infers directly from created things that God the Creator exists. Ibn Taymiyyah's notion of Firah also shares a peculiar feature with Avicenna's faculty of estimation. The epistemic range of both is limited to objects of sense. Neither Avicenna's estimative faculty nor Ibn Taymiyyah's Firah has access to an incorporeal world of intellects or an incorporeal first cause. Whereas Avicenna says that the Firah of the estimative faculty conflicts with the Firah of the intellect regarding the intelligible world, Ibn Taymiyyah simply denies that the immaterial and intelligible world of Avicenna has any existence whatsoever. Ibn Taymiyyah's notion of Fira does not include Avicenna's sphere of the intellect. It includes only Avicenna's sphere of the estimation. So far as Ibn Taymiyyah is concerned, the incorporeal intelligible world of Avicenna does not exist, and the God that he posits as its first cause has no existence either. The import of Ibn Taymiyyah's approach becomes clear in his large tome Bayan Talbis al-Yamiyat, Explication of the Deceit of the Yamiyat, which is a refutation of Fakhr al-Din al-Razi's, D 606/1210, Tas al-Taqdis, establishing sanctification. In Tas al-Taqdis, al-Razi accuses Enlil and Karami theologians of corporealism in God's attributes, and he argues to the contrary that God is incorporeal, not subject to spatial extension and not perceptible by the human senses. Al-Razi explains that the estimation, wam, and the imagination, kale, exercise their functions only in objects of sense perception, and that they therefore cannot perceive God, God's attributes and God's acts. 40 Hoover, IBN. In Bayan, Ibn Taymiyyah refutes al-Razi at length on both rational and textual grounds. Here I will mention only what is relevant to Fira. Al-Razi says that God is neither distinct from the world nor dwelling in the world so as to exonerate God of spatial extension and location. Ibn Taymiyyah maintains to the contrary that the Fira cannot affirm the existence of something that is neither inside the world nor outside of it. To the Fira, something that is neither inside the world nor outside of it simply does not exist at all. Instead, the Fira knows necessarily that God is above the world, and the Fira does not deny that the Creator is a body, jism. Yet even though the Fira does not deny that God has a body, Ibn Taymiyyah is reticent to affirm a body of God explicitly because the Quran, the Sunnah, and the Salaf, that is, the early Muslims, do not speak of God using that term. Ibn Taymiyyah does however affirm that God is accessible to the human senses, and he traces this to the Salaf as well. The generality of the Salaf and those who affirm God's attributes maintain that God can be witnessed, seen, and sensed. Ibn Taymiyyah notes that some of the messengers have heard and seen God in this life, and he states that God will be seen in the hereafter. Moreover, Ibn Taymiyyah observes that the faculties of estimation and imagination predominate in human beings when it comes to theological matters. Avicenna and the philosophical tradition would agree but then posit a higher incorporeal reality which those with more powerful intellects can access. Ibn Taymiyyah, however, turns this elitism on its head. He argues that, if indeed the estimation and imagination were wrong, then the Shara would have negated them. The lawmaker would have indicated clearly that God is very different from how we imagine him to be. Yet, the lawmaker has not said this. Ibn Taymiyyah also places the intellect, on the same epistemological level as the estimation and the imagination. Al-Razi claims that the human estimation and imagination cannot know God, but Ibn Taymiyyah responds that this is equivalent to saying that the human intellect cannot know God either. 44 for Al. To conclude, Al-Darimi, the Enlil and Ibn Taymiyyah constitute a stream of traditionalist theology that maintains that God is an extra-mental sensible entity located above the heavens and over the throne. Al-Darimi establishes the clear outlines of spatialism in argumentation against Anaf opponents whom he accuses of Yamism. The implications of this spatialist theology become especially clear when comparing the later and more sophisticated figures of Avicenna and Ibn Taymiyyah on the character of the human natural constitution, Fira. Ibn Taymiyyah's notion of Fira is like the estimative faculty in Avicenna psychology insofar as the epistemic scope of both is limited to objects of sense perception. From an Avicennan perspective, Ibn Taymiyyah gives free rein to the Fira of the estimative faculty and allows it to crowd out the Fira of the intellect completely. The scope of human knowledge in Ibn Taymiyyah's epistemology seems not to extend beyond that of the animal soul in Avicenna psychology. To Avicenna, Ibn Taymiyyah would have appeared entirely unaware of higher realities. This no doubt explains some of the diffidence toward Ibn Taymiyyah found in some contemporary Muslim circles when it comes to theological matters. Even though Ibn Taymiyyah hesitates to say explicitly that God has a body, he opens the door to theological corporealism, which to Kalam theologians and philosophers in the Avicennan stream is sheer ignorance at best and unbelief at worst. Ibn Taymiyyah and fellow spatialists of course have their retort: nothing exists but objects susceptible to sense perception, and relegating God to the intelligible world is tantamount to denying God's existence entirely. Ibn Taymiyyah simply rehearses in more sophisticated form a theological conflict that goes back at least to Al-Darimi. Strikingly different visions of God's nature and God's accessibility to the human senses have stood at the core of the conflict between traditionalist spatialists on the one hand, and Kalam theologians and philosophers, on the other, from the early centuries of Islam. Bibliography. Ahmed. The philosopher O.K. Buzma has once compared the state of epistemology in contemporary philosophical discourse with that of people living in a closed enclosure surrounded only by thick walls and dummy doors, while they could not escape the idea that something lay beyond the walls. No amount of effort by some to push the dummy doors, or perception that there might be a chink revealing some light coming through, could convince the others that this was truly the case. D. Zeta. Phillips has compared this with the state of contemporary philosophy of religion. We have encountered many dummy doors in our discussions, doors which claim to give, but cannot provide, the required knowledge of God. For all pushers and pullers at these doors, God is indeed a mystery, a reality beyond the reach of our epistemic practices. Religious mysteries are turned into epistemological mysteries. Once this transition has taken place, the problem is characterized as one of showing how we in the world, inside the enclosure, can talk of God, who is outside the enclosure. A far cry from the tight enclosures of 20th century post-Kantian philosophy of religion, the mystic Abu Lib al-Maki, d. 386-996, writing his major work The Nourishment of the Hearts, Qut al-Qulub, towards the end of the 4th/10th century, was concerned not with the possibility of knowledge of God itself, but with the degree to which knowledge and faith of God could be affirmed with certitude, yaqin. In contrast to the hard modern doors of Buzma, in al-Maki's Qut, we encounter an allegory of gentle veils covering doorways. While all knowers of God share the common designation of believer, there is a vast difference between a believer who knows only 10 aspects, man, of God from behind a veil and one who knows 100,000 aspects directly and unveiled. Thus, there are 3 levels of belief. The first type of believer only derives his knowledge concerning the article of belief second-hand from report, khabar, rather than experience, khabar. He is like the person who is told so and so is at my house and believes this. Such belief can be subjected to doubt even from the start. The second type of believer is comparable to someone who has not only been told of the presence of the other, but has been brought to her, yet only hears her voice from behind a veil. At this level, belief goes beyond mere report, it is accompanied by a piece of evidence, dalil. However, as one could be mistaken by such evidence since voices can appear to be similar to one another, this type of belief is also subject to doubt. Al-Maki reinforces this point by arguing that if the person were told that the voice was not of the person they had in mind, but someone who sounded similar, the evidence involved, that is, the voice, that had brought some certainty would not be sufficient to withstand such expressed doubts. In contrast to the first 2 types of believers, the third is comparable to the person who sees the other sitting in the other room, with no veil between them. In such a case, the believer has ascended beyond the level of the first 2 types of knowledge and belief, report and evidence, and now possesses certain belief that cannot be dislodged by doubt. This tripartite division of knowledge and belief can be seen as a description of the ascension of the believer from the common foundations of scripture and reasoning to a direct form of knowing impervious to doubt. It can also be seen as a reflection of a hierarchy of believers, arranged respectively according to 3 forms of knowledge, transmitted knowledge, rational proof and mystical knowing. Both individual and social dimensions of this tripartite division are explored in al-Maki's work, which is considered one of first detailed expositions of Sufism as it formed into a distinct intellectual and spiritual tradition in the 4th/10th century. The study of epistemology in early Islamic thought has understandably focused mainly on the more explicitly philosophical traditions of Kalam and Falsafa, and to a lesser degree on Islamic law and hadith study. However, in the competitive intellectual atmosphere of the Grand Inquisition of the Mina and its aftermath, most emerging traditions in this period found it increasingly necessary to justify their intellectual foundations, not least the emerging Sufi tradition. In this period, works such as The Nourishment of the Hearts attempted to ground the spiritual insights of the knowers of the esoteric, Ulam al-Bin, in the learning of scholars of the exoteric sciences, al-Malhir, while also defining what differentiated the 2 domains of knowledge from one another. In like fashion, Sufism would prove to be an important part of the synthesis between intellectual traditions of the later Islamic tradition, from the master project of intellectual and spiritual revival of Abu Mid al-Ghazali, d. 505-1111, to the mystical philosophy of the school of Mu'addin ibn Arab, d. 638-1240. While al-Maki did not formulate his intellectual system in as coherent a fashion as we would find in later Sufi works, his nourishment stands at the beginning of this long-standing contribution of mystical thinkers to the intellectual traditions of Islam. In this chapter, I will explore this early effort to account for the place of mystical knowledge through the wider epistemological schema of the nourishment, looking both at how knowledge is acquired at the individual level as well as its broader consequences in society. The individual dimension of knowledge and the science of inner motive powers, ilm al-Qair. The grounding of knowledge in Sufism can be seen as part of a broader discussion on the very foundations of human consciousness. Thus, before providing us a detailed exposition of his epistemology in chapter 31 of The Nourishment, al-Maki explores, in chapter 30, the source of our inward states of mind with the concept of a inner motive power, kir, al-Qair. The Qair can be seen as similar to the idea of fantasia within the Stoic tradition, or Yetzer within the Judaic tradition. Although this concept and a related discipline of knowledge is occasionally referred to within other Sufi texts from this period, we find no detailed discussion of the Qair until the appearance of al-Maki's text, which to a certain extent is based on the exposition provided in the earlier works of the theologian and precursor of Sufi piety, al-Rith al-Muzab, d. 243-857-58. Hence, a more fruitful precursory discussion of this idea should begin by exploring it within the wider context of theological discourse with which al-Muzab and al-Maki were engaged. The root form khr is not Quranic, although a few examples can be found within the hadith corpus that has reached us. However, It seems likely that early theological discussions of inner motive powers of the mind arose out of reflections over traditions concerning the two spirits, Lamiton, one encouraging the individual to good, and the other to evil. It should be recalled that the early Mutazila were not only theoreticians, but were concerned with ascetic piety as part of the broader milieu of what Marshall Hodgson has termed the pious-minded opposition in the late Umayyad/early Abbasid period. However, as Mutazilism evolved into philosophical theology, concern with the impact of spiritual forces on human psychology became translated into inner cognitive mechanics understood from the broader cosmology of Kalam. Thus, Al-Ashar, D. 324/935-36, reports to us that, by the time of Abu al-Hudhayl al-Alf, D. 227/841, 42 or 235/849, 50, Mutazils generally perceived the two Lamiton as accidents, are, in the mind. Nevertheless, the Mutazils disagreed among themselves over the nature and source of the Qahir, as well as how they fit within their broader concerns about the theology of free choice and divine predestination. There was some resistance to complete the depersonification of the Lamiton of the type advocated by Abu al-Hudhayl's student, Al-Nam, D. between 220/835 and 230/845, who rejected the idea that Qahir were the result of external forces, demonic or otherwise, proposing rather that they were latent, kamina, within the human psyche. Al-Nam also 6 examples of these in Wensen, advocated the principle that the Qahir were necessary for establishing human moral responsibility, which his teacher and other Mutazils also rejected, fearing the implications that this would have on their absolute detachment of God from evil human acts. The result of this disagreement might have been the formulation of a more complex psychological schema, one that went beyond the binary of good and bad Lamiton. It took into consideration additional aspects of the human psyche such as the human intellect, Aql, which Abu al-Hudhayl saw as exercising moral judgment in its own right. Without going into all the specifics of the evolution of Qahir theory among the Mutazila, we can generally conclude that there was a shift from the original binary idea of two Lamiton towards increased psychological and moral complexity, so that the term Qahir came to generally refer to all types of inner motive powers resulting in human action. Similar concerns were addressed by theologians outside the Mutazil camp, such as the Proto-Sunni al-Muzab. With al-Muzab, we see an attempt to incorporate the idea of inner motive powers as part of his general concern with introspection, Muzaba, and the moral reform required to arrive at true fulfillment of the law, Shar, and deeper connection with the divine. For al-Muzab, ensuring that one's internal actions, Amal al-Qulub, are in alignment with the safeguarding of divine laws is the first duty of the individual. In order to do this, one must first investigate any clear instigating an action and refrain from performing such an action without first assessing its moral value. The Qawadir are defined here as invitations of. Then gone on to speculate about the possible influences of Zoroastrian, Greek and Jewish thought. 3. pp. See the remarks on it. 4. pp. 2. This content down, knowledge and belief, the heart to every good or evil act. A distinction, therefore, could be made between more transient Qahir and the set of determined intentions, idict. While we are responsible for safeguarding ourselves from the former, it is only with the latter that moral responsibility properly falls into place. Corresponding with increasingly elaborate psychological schema as developed by other theologians of the time, al-Muzab saw 5 sources of Qahir, the self, nafs, and the devil motivating evil actions. The intellect, angels, and God directly motivating good actions. While the significance and long-term impact of al-Muzab on the Sufi tradition cannot be denied, it is interesting to note that his terminology and psychological schema do not appear to have been taken up by Sufis until the composition of al-Makkiyah's Nourishment. Abu Bakr al-Kalabadi, D. 380/980, dedicated a short chapter to the science of Qahir in his introduction to the doctrine of the Sufis, al-Tariq li Madhab al-Altawaf. But unlike al-Muzab, he did not include the intellect as one of the sources of inner motivation. Nor does the concept of Qahir itself receive anything more than sporadic treatment in other early Sufi writings that have survived, even in the works of al-Makkiyah's spiritual ancestor Sahl al-Tustari, D. 283/896. Resistance among early mystics to al-Muzab's view of the intellect could be attributed to suspicion of his engagement with Kalam theology, as many were inclined towards traditionalism. It is unclear, however, why the science of Qahir is given little attention in early Sufi sources. Although one explanation could be that such works were often focused on the more advanced stages of the spiritual path, rather than aspects of basic piety and practice, as we find in al-Muzab. Nevertheless, it is only with al-Makkiyah's Nourishment that we can see the first serious attempt at developing al-Muzab's theory of the Qahir. According to al-Makki, the heart is the vessel containing the different Qahir that appear and, therefore, can be considered a treasure store. 14 al-Muzab, through which divine beauty and majesty are revealed. Through which divine beauty and majesty are revealed. Al-Makki then compares the heart to a body that possesses different parts. 2 of these, the lower self, nafs, and the spirit, are loci, makanan, which become the battleground for 2 personalities, shak. Two of these, the lower self, through which divine beauty and majesty are revealed. Al-Makki then compares the heart to a body that possesses different parts. Two of these, the lower self, nafs, and the spirit, are loci, makanan, which become the battleground for two personalities, shak. Finally, the enemy. Two of these, the lower self, nafs, and the spirit, are loci, makanan, which become the battleground for two personalities, shak. The enemy, namely, the devil, and the angel, drawing on two of the heart's qualities, aran the intellect and the passions, hawa. Finally, the heart also contains two lights, Nuran the light of knowledge, ilm, and the light of faith, iman. Al-Makki compares the heart to a king in relation to his army, or that of a mirror in relation to the source of the reflections that shine upon it. Following this description of these different components of the heart, Al-Makki provides a more detailed description, tafel, of the different types of qalur that arise in the heart, of which there are 6. First there are the qalur that come from the lower self and the enemy, which give rise to evil actions. Their counterparts which give rise to good actions are the spirit, and angel, malik, respectively. In between these 4, the intellect arbitrates and decides on the course of actions, sometimes siding with good qalur and sometimes with their opposites. And finally, there are qalur that bring about certitude, yaqin, which is the result of faith and knowledge. Based on this we can see that Al-Makki modifies Al-Muzab's five-fold psychological schema, assigning a more neutral role for the intellect of decision-making. In Muzab, it is only a source of good impulses. In addition to this, a more detailed picture of psychological motives is given, including the role of knowledge. While Al-Muzab simply talks about inspirations from God and angels, Al-Makki provides a description of such heavenly sources of qalur that clarifies the distinction between lights of faith and knowledge as well as degrees of certitude, yaqin. It is worth underlining here the importance of understanding knowledge as divine encounter and manifestation in Al-Makki's teaching. The heart itself is considered part of the spiritual realm, acting as the counterpart to the physical senses. It, too, contains 5 senses, receiving stimuli from both the earthly and spiritual realms, yielding experience, mushahida, with its vision, understanding, fahm, with its hearing, speech, kalam, with its taste, knowledge, ilm, with its smell. It is through this inner 4th sense that the inborn intellect, al-aql al-gharizi, develops into the acquired intellect, al-aql al-mutasib. Thus, we should understand the qalur arising from knowledge to come not only from external sources, that is, learning, knowledge and belief in nourishment of the heart's 87, or transmitted knowledge from others, but also internal knowledge that has already been absorbed and retained in the individual memory. However, it is the 5th inner sense of touch that brings about the sublime tearing of the heart's outer veil and the arrival at its innermost core, resulting in divine encounter, wajd, arising from the attainment of spiritual stations. It is here that the individual, through the purification of the body and heart, begins to become more aware of the expansion of faith that is certitude, the 6th among the qalur. Why does Al-Makki feel the need to include a 6th form of qalur separate from the intellect to account for certain knowledge? We see that he affirms the role of the intellect in providing foundational knowledge and judgments, especially in determining moral values. Without this, human moral responsibility would not be possible. However, the intellect is restricted from true knowledge of divine oneness, Todd. He who looks to his intellect to affirm divine oneness, his affirmation of divine oneness will not save him from the hellfire. And he whose affirmation of divine unity in this world is dependent on what is intelligible, maql, will not attain through its certitude, yaqin. And elsewhere, there is no cognition, tafakur, of divine unity, Todd, and divine witnessing, mushahida, nor is there visual perception, of divine illusion, ishara, nor is there a cognizable order, tartib, to divine power, kudra. It is therefore clear that by certitude Al-Makki here does not mean that which is acquired by rational reflection or learning, but something from beyond the realm of the intellect, attainable only by the spiritual elite. The knowledge of certitude, ilm al-yaqin, cannot be ignited in the location, madan, literally, mind, of the intellect, as the intellectual forms of knowledge are created, al-malik al-makhlukat. Nor can certitude be the product of thought, fikr, or the result of contemplation, tadabbur. Those things which are the result of thoughts, afkar, or whatever qalur or forms of knowledge, that occur through the innate disposition, fira, are the forms of knowledge pertaining to the intellect, al-malikul. They are unveilings of 22 Al-Makki, the believers, Kushab al-Rifn, and the praiseworthy qualities among the people of the religion, Mamd al-Din. As for the gear of certitude, it manifests from the eye of certitude, Ain al-Yaqin, it calls out to a servant, seeking him directly, because it is specially reserved for him. What remains to be understood is whether the intellect and mundane types of knowledge, that is, knowledge not derived through the qalur of certitude, have any role to play in spiritual unveilings. The passage just cited could be understood to imply that there is a strict hierarchy of knowledge in which certitude reigns supreme over intellectual forms of knowing and learning, thus potentially raising the problem of spiritual elitism and the consequent accusations of antinomianism and absolution from religious authority, which are often raised against mystics. Al-Makki addresses this issue using the metaphor of an oil lamp to explain the relationship between the intellect, knowledge, and faith that results in certitude when these aspects are combined. Faith, which is strengthened by cautious moral scrutiny, wera, and brought to perfection through fear of God, kaf, is comparable to the wick which lights the lamp. Knowledge is the oil that provides it with the fuel to burn, while the intellect is the water that contains the oil and thus provides the foundation upon which the lamp can burn. The heart is, of course, the lamp itself. Basing himself on Q47:19 and 11:14, Al-Makki tells us that divine unity, Tod, is perceived only after the acquisition of knowledge. When this knowledge increases sufficiently, the believer increases in faith and is able to perceive in his witnessing, mushahida, of the divine what is not known to others. Conversely, when there is a deficit in knowledge, faith is diminished, and in that reduced state of faith the believer's experience of divine oneness is veiled and any experience of witnessing is merely the result of his own imagination. While the intellect in Al-Makki's epistemology has a restricted role, confined as it is to mundane objects of knowledge, it still plays an essential part in attaining the level of certitude required for knowledge of the divine. This is especially the case when it comes to moral reasoning, which harks back to the very early days of Islamic theology when Qayyar theorists were more focused on the question of moral responsibility, in which a sound intellect that can determine right from wrong is sufficient proof, ajaya, for moral culpability. Yet as a mystic who has meditated on the depths of human soul, Al-Makki is also inclined toward seeing room for moral ambiguity due to the subtle ways in which spiritual forces, good and evil, can attempt to manipulate the intellect. Overall, there is a tendency here to downplay the role of the intellect in attaining certain knowledge in favor of extra-intellectual sources, whether they be from within, certitude, or without, revealed knowledge as transmitted through scripture and prophetic narrations. Thus, Al-Makki's more complex Qayyar schema builds on the views of his predecessors to allow not only for the full incorporation of mystical knowledge and spiritual insights into our understanding of the foundations of human consciousness, but also the affirmation of mundane forms of learning and scholarship in the path to attaining true knowledge of God. The social dimension of knowledge and the science of exposition, Ilm al-Tafel. In Al-Makki's discussion of the six Qayyar in chapter 30 of the Nourishment, a social hierarchy is given according to which types of believers are consistently connected to the various inner motive powers. At the lowest rank are the generality, of believers, who are still consistently attached to the Qayyar coming from the lower self and the devil, which call on them to evil actions and actions which go against religious knowledge, ilm. Next in rank are the elect, ku, from among the believers, who are consistently attached to the Qayyar of the angelic forces that speak through the spirit, are, of the individual, calling only to good and true actions that correspond with religious knowledge. The Qayyar of the intellect shared by both these ranks does not consistently lead one to good or bad actions, at times siding with the evil Qayyar and at times siding with the good, contingent on the degree to which such powers have control over the heart. It is only those at the highest rank, the believers who are given connection to the Qayyar of certitude, who can consistently carry out actions that are commanded by the divine, even when such knowledge is obscure to the learned scholars of religious knowledge. Here Al-Makki makes a distinction between the scholars of exoteric learning, al-Hir, and those who possess knowledge of the esoteric, al-Bin. This becomes a central theme in chapter 31 of the Nourishment, which is concerned mainly with the general state of learning and scholarship in Al-Makki's time and the position of esoteric knowledge and unveiling within this wider intellectual context. Early on in this chapter, he provides a concise description of exoteric knowledge. This form of knowledge is knowledge of laws and legal opinions, the knowledge of Islam. Its path is the faculty of hearing, Sam, its 28 Al-Makki, Qut al-Qulub. Key is deduction, Istidlal, and its storehouse is the intellect, Aql. It is recorded in books and inscribed in papers, transmitted from the old to the young through the tongues. It remains so long as Islam remains, and exists so long as the Muslims exist, because it is God's proof, ajaya, over all creation. The Prophet has informed us regarding this knowledge, which is equipped and safeguarded on the surfaces of books. It is the external aspect of the religion, here al-din, and ignorance and absence of it will lead to polytheism, shirk. Note the reappearance of the term proof, ajaya, which we saw earlier used in reference to the intellect and its role in affirming individual moral responsibility. Exoteric knowledge or transmitted learning here also plays the role of proof, only for creation as a whole. Thus, not only are mundane forms of knowing and learning through scholarly and intellectual means essential in their role for safeguarding the beliefs of the community, but as a proof over all creation also serve an ultimate purpose in the wider cosmic scheme. Even though Al-Makki would go on later in the chapter, and consistently throughout his work, to advocate the view that knowledge of the esoteric acquired through certitude and those who possess it are superior to the exoteric, it is clear that the latter plays an indispensable role within his broader social epistemology. This is due to the important role that exoteric knowledge plays in validating the belief of the common person not privy to knowledge of the esoteric. As we have seen earlier, Al-Makki employs the metaphor of the oil lamp to highlight the necessary role that knowledge plays alongside the intellect to bring the heart to a state of faith and, ultimately, certitude. Once faith has attained the sufficient conditions and increased to the level of certitude, it brings about the attainment of gnosis, marifah. However, This does not mean that a believer who has not attained the level of certitude herself is bereft of any contact with it. Al-Makki makes an important distinction here between the indirect gnosis attained through sam, hearing, or transmission, and the direct one through certitude. Thus, there is a difference between the simple faith of the average believer who comes into contact with the knowledge of certitude, ilm al-yaqin, indirectly through learning and transmission, and the direct experience of the mystic attained through the eye of certitude, ain al-yaqin. The difference between the two lies in the mode by which they arrive at the certitude. Thus, for Al-Makki, there are two types of perception, mushahida, corresponding to the exoteric and the esoteric. 29 Al-Makki. 1 Mushahidat al-Istidlal, perception based on proofs. This form of witnessing occurs after the knowledge acquired by transmission, Marifat al-Kabar. Al-Makki describes it as a form of knowledge that is transmitted through speech and teaching, Talm. This can be understood also as a second-hand form of knowledge sufficient to bring about the indirect form of certitude. 2 Mushahidat al-Dalil, perception of that which proofs themselves are based on. This direct form of perception is experienced only after the attainment of the previous form, which is based on proof. According to Al-Makki, one attains this through no medium other than divine encounter, wajd, through the eye of certitude. Through this scheme, Al-Makki is able to both affirm the transcendental nature of true certitude yet also concurrently affirm the validity of non-transcendental degrees of faith insofar as they derive from the transmitted knowledge derived of those who have attained the former. Based on this, one can draw out a more detailed explanation of the different ways in which people acquire certitude. Al-Makki divides certitude into 3 levels, maqamat. 1 Certitude intermingled with doubt. Al-Makki also describes this as the certitude of rational proofs and religious sciences. He explicitly identifies it as the type of certitude associated with Kalam theologians, Mutakalimun, highlighting how it increases or decreases according to the quality of reasoning or transmitted knowledge from other scholars. At best, such scholars possess an understanding closer to the truth due to their affiliation with those who possess direct sight. 2 Certitude based on affirmation and acceptance, Tad Wal-Istislam. This form of certitude is that of average believers, described as the innocent, abrar. While it is subject to fluctuation, varying according to the individual's level of piety, it is not subject to the doubt of the first level of certitude, since it is based firmly on transmitted knowledge, kabar, that is, scripture and prophetic tradition. 3 Certitude based on direct visionary encounter, mu'ayana. This is the highest form, attained by the righteous and the martyrs, those who bear witness, al-shuhad. The one who attains this is described as one with experience, kabar, although his knowing does not contradict the knowledge given through transmission, kabar, namely, authentic religious tradition. While there is arguably some wiggle room for arriving at certitude through rational proofs. This threefold division reveals Al-Makki's own theological preference for the cautious traditionalist approach of the Anbal school, rather than the rationalist approach of his contemporaries from the emerging Sunni Kalam traditions. Of the different types of exoteric scholar in his time, he places those who engage in Kalam at a lower level than those scholars who focus on the transmission of prophetic reports and narrations. This reflects Al-Makki's broader historical diagnosis of a gradual decline in the state of the community after the proliferation of book learning and proliferation of Kalam theology from the 2nd/8th century. Al-Makki's preference for traditionalist scholars over the methods of rational proof in Kalam may seem to contradict the threefold division of knowledge using the allegory of doorways, presented at the very start of this discussion. According to this, knowledge based on proofs, albeit subject to doubt, would appear superior to knowledge based on a report, kabar. If this is the case, then surely any effort to establish knowledge of God based on proofs, notwithstanding its limitations, should be superior to the method of simple fideism and affirmation of transmitted revelation and prophetic reports. This is where it is important to return to Al-Makki's earlier statement on the essential nature of exoteric knowledge and its transmission. What troubles him is not so much the method of approaching God but ensuring correspondence between such exoteric learning and esoteric truths. As time passed and historical changes such as book learning brought about a significant transformation in the modes and motivations of exoteric scholarship, the harmonious correspondence between it and esoteric knowledge broke down, resulting in the appearance of distorted forms of religious scholarship and learning. This leads us to a final question regarding Al-Makki's epistemology. Short of attaining direct knowledge based on certitude, how can one find the correspondence between exoteric and esoteric knowledge? In other words, if the mundane, that is, the intellect and transmitted knowledge, cannot attain knowledge of the transcendent, how can we be sure that faith sits on sound foundations and that we are headed in the right direction towards certitude? Is the average person untouched by direct divine encounter, like Buzma, standing before hard impenetrable doors, seeing God as a divine mystery beyond the reach of our epistemic practices? A first possible solution to this problem is to affirm the strict hierarchy between the exoteric and esoteric, which places the average believer in the problematic position of merely submitting to those who claim to possess knowledge of the latter. Al-Makki appears to reject this solution. Among the more noticeable aspects of his general critique of different claims to knowledge in his time is his attack on certain quarters of the evolving mystical tradition in Islam. Those who expressed esoteric truths through the medium of mystical ecstatic utterances, shot. He contends that such utterances do more harm than good, as they are prone to be misunderstood by the common believer. Instead, he advocates a method of bridging the gap between the mundane/exoteric and the transcendent/esoteric through the employment of scholarly language based on scripture and prophetic tradition. While intellectual means cannot attain the reality of divine oneness or the direct witnessing of divine realities, he argues that it is necessary for there to be a science of elucidation, ilm al-tafel. It is based on the language of the revealed law, lisan al-shar. Aimed at manifesting the paths, uruk. Casting light on the ways, subul. Guiding the wayfarers, salikin, and laying down a regimen for worshippers, mil, so that those who were to die might die after seeing a clear proof, and so that those who were to live might live after seeing a clear proof, Q 842. And God always prevails in his purpose, Q 1221. The science of Tafel, therefore, like the divine signs in creation, lays down a path to divine reality, yet is distinct from it. It guides one to it, rather than constitutes the reality itself. To borrow a well-known expression today, the map is not the territory and, perhaps more appropriately for a text titled The Nourishment of Hearts, the menu is not the meal. Essentially, what al-Makki is advocating here is not simply the priority of the transcendent over the mundane, but a science of the spiritual path that can bridge the gap between the two. From this perspective, al-Makki's earlier statement about the cosmic significance of exoteric knowledge comes to life. Without it, no map can be drawn, no menu can be written, and no bridge can be built. Significantly, this also enables the validation of the belief of the common believer, insofar as it faithfully adheres to exoteric knowledge, while also affirming the role of scholars and teachers of such knowledge, as well as the role of spiritual masters and guides who play the role of bridging the gap between such knowledge and esoteric truths. Instead of Buzma's impenetrable hard doors, what we encounter in al-Makki's nourishment are gentle liminal veils that allow for the journey between the mundane and the transcendent. The gap between the two realms makes the case for the development of a science of the mystical path. Conclusion. The crystallization of the Sufi tradition during the 3rd/9th and 4th/10th centuries can be seen as part of the broader consolidation of scholarly disciplines during this period. From jurisprudence, law, theology, and philosophy to the scriptural sciences of the Quran and Hadith. Amidst the competition cutting across sectarian and intellectual divides, Sufi masters put forward their own distinctive paradigms of knowledge, while also attempting to position themselves vis-a-vis other disciplines of learning. A necessary aspect was to identify what was distinctive and essential to the path of Sufi learning, for the purposes of laying down the foundations for spiritual seekers as well as to defend the legitimacy of these foundations against outside criticism. Above and beyond this, Sufi theorists, to differing degrees, also presented the foundations of Sufi knowledge as essential and primary to the belief and practice of all Muslims. Among the pioneers of Sufism, we can detect traces of differing approaches to the following question: in what way is Sufi knowing or knowledge related to knowledge within the Islamic tradition as a whole? Observing the intellectual turbulence of the period, al-Musabb accounted for the existence of diverse sects by the vast differences between those who titled themselves knowers, ulam. Those knowers of the hereafter who truly deserved this designation were few and far between, while the vast majority of claimants fell short due to their lack of piety, which in the worst case manifested itself as pretension. Al-Musabb's more careful approach can be seen against the background of the Maya, or theological inquisition, and the consequent formation of a Sunni consensus across the Abbasid Caliphate. While his focus on inner psychology anticipates some of the key aspects of what later became the Sufi tradition, al-Musabb seems less concerned with forming a distinctive mode of piety than utilizing the narrative of lost piety in order to call for an intellectual and social regeneration of the Ummah. This can be contrasted to the approach seen in statements by Dhu al-Nun al-Mir, D 245/859, 60, who adopted a bolder distinction between spiritually advanced knowers, ribn, and scholars, in which the former are considered superior to the latter. The great founder of the Sufi tradition of Baghdad, Junayd, D 298/910, adopted a midway position in which the uncompromising stance of Mir was maintained behind a carefully tended garden of oblique technical language and efforts to win over scholastics to the side of mystics. Al-Makki's nourishment, which was composed during the latter half of the 4th/10th century, employs the more straightforward scholarly language of al-Musabb to articulate a position that appears closer to al-Mir's. Unlike most other Sufi authors of the period, who were perhaps adopting the cautiousness of Junayd, he takes a more unambiguous position on the superiority of certitude over all other forms of knowledge, and of the inward and esoteric, bin, over the outward and exoteric, here. Yet, he also advocates moral and social reform through the affirmation of the role of the sciences of Islamic tradition, much in the same way as al-Musabb before him. Several generations later, this kind of approach would result in al-Ghazali's more thoroughly systematic revival of the religious sciences. It is important to recognize that al-Makki wrote at a time when disciplinary and sectarian boundaries were still establishing themselves. Thus, the nourishment itself moves rather fluidly between different exoteric sciences and often articulates its science of elucidation, in a way that seems less technical and systematic than even some of the works of al-Makki's near contemporaries. In fact, most noteworthy is his avoidance of the use of term Sufi itself, reserved mainly for those practitioners of ecstatic utterances whom he disdained. It is tempting, especially given his inclinations towards Anbal traditionalism, to conclude that, in comparison with other mystical authors of his time and al-Ghazali a century later, al-Makki was more of a fideist. However, this would be missing the forest for the trees. For him, the issue was not so much the employment of a particular method in exoteric knowledge, although he had his preferences, but ensuring that there was correspondence between it and the esoteric truths attained through certitude. Witnessing events from the liminal world of the grave, al-Makki might have applauded al-Ghazali's efforts to strengthen the foundations of the intellectual disciplines and harmonize the exoteric and the esoteric religious sciences. 38 Al-Sulami, a back.
ناخد راحة، احنا كده شغالين بقالنا ساعة ونص. تعالوا نلعب دور. دور Age of Empires. ناخد راحة قبل ما ندخل بقى في نظرية المعرفة الكلاسيكية التقليدية الأشعرية الماتريدية السنية، التي اختلطت أيضا بالنظرية المعتزلية السيناوي. مش مقتنع أنا نهائيا بالنظرية مش عايز أقول الصوفية، بس هي يعني نقدر نسميها العرفانية أفضل. 1v1 Arabia random map. Sicilians vs Franks. ماشي. أنا غالبا هخسر، بس نتسلى وخلاص. بسم الله.
Attaccato! Comandi, a vostro servizio. Ho capito. Ho fatto. Capito. Sì, signore. Salutato. Muratori. Attaccare. Ho fatto. Sì, signore. Ho capito. Ho fatto.
Muratori. Salutiamo.
A vostro
Muratori.
servizio. Comandi, sì, signore. Ho fatto. Sì, signore. Ho fatto. Ho capito. A vostro servizio.
Sì, sì. Muratori.
Sì, comandi. A vostro servizio.
Pronto. Ordine. Muratori.
Sì,
Tagliamenti.
comandi. A vostro servizio. Sì, signore. Ho fatto. Combattente. Sì, signore. Ho fatto.
Sì, minatori.
Pronto sono. Ordini. Giusto. Sì, sì. Tagliamenti. Salutiamo. Braccianti.
Sì,
Immediatamente.
ho fatto.
Ordini. Giusto.
Ordini.
Muratori.
Pronta.
A vostro servizio. Sì, ho fatto. Ho fatto. Capito. Ho fatto. Sì, signore. A vostro servizio. Attaccare. Ho fatto. Sì, signore. Combattente. Attaccato. Attaccare. Sì, signore. Ho fatto. Capito.
Pronto sono. Sei.
Sì, a vostro servizio. Ho fatto. Sì, ho fatto.
Salutiamo.
A vostro servizio.
Sì, va bene.
Sì, attaccare.
Ordini. Sei. Muratori.
Sì, signore. Sì, a vostro servizio. Attaccare.
Salutiamo.
Muratori.
A vostro servizio. Ho fatto. Combattente. Attaccato. Combattente. Capito. Attaccare.
Pronto sono. Muratori.
Sì, ho fatto. Sì, signore. A vostro servizio, signore. Ho fatto. Combattente. Sì, capito. Comandi. Sì, sì, signore. Attaccare. A vostro servizio. Ho fatto. Comandi. Sì, capito. Sì, signore. Attaccare. Sì, ho fatto.
Salutiamo. Muratori.
A vostro servizio. Combattente. Comandi. A vostro servizio. Sì, combattente.
Ordini. Muratori. Muratori. Muratori.
Sì, a vostro servizio.
Sì, sì. Muratori. Pronto sono. Muratori. Salutiamo. Muratori.
Comandi. Sì, capito.
Sì. Muratori. Ordini.
Pronto sono. Muratori. Tagliamenti.
Sì. Muratori.
Sì, sì.
Ordini.
Salutare. Muratori. Ordini. Minatori. Taglialini.
Non fa, capito.
Sì, sì. Muratori.
A posto sei fatto. Capito. Attaccato. Sì, sì signore.
Pronto, contadino.
Sì.
Sì, sì, giusto. Muratori.
Quanti capelli. Attaccati.
يبدو ان كان خطأ ان انا مهاجمش الذهب، ركزت على الخشب بزيادة.
Ordini minatori.
Appostetevi i capelli. Combattete.
Salutato. Immediatamente. Pronto? Sì.
Fessi, taglialini,
Sì, sì. Contadino. Tagliadini. Ordini.
immediatamente,
Salutato. Ordini immediatamente. Pronto?
Inu, Fessi,
Sì, sì.
salutiamo, taglialegna,
اظن انا خسرت يعني، استسلم. ولا اكمل للاخر.
Salutato. Muratori.
انا الوضع بتاعي صعب اوي، مش هقدر اكسب. ماشي، نرجع آه، موضوعنا، بس يعني نقرا بشكل تحليلي أكتر. نلخص الكلام. مش هنسمع، احنا هنقرا بصوت. اقصد يعني هقرا بصوتي انا يعني. آه، 17 صفحة. حلو. حلو. لو مسحنا كمان الهوامش هتبقى أصغر. ماشي. introduction. بحبها تبقى على الجنب كده. خلي كله times new roman. نظبط الأحجام. 12. justify 1.5 والlayout 0 0 0 0. margins normal. orientation portrait size A4. إذا لما عمل كده في واحد بس، يعني كله 0 0 0. لا أنا 0 0 0 0. margins normal. orientation portrait size A4. حسنا كده تمام. دي heading 1. ماشي. update heading 1. Much of what the science of Kalam was concerned with were entities that the Mutakallimun thought were removed from direct experience, notably God. مش مهم الكلام ده، بس نسيب. Theologians also discussed a number of questions which could not be decided based on direct sense experience, such as whether the world has entered existence at some point in the past or has always existed. Theologians were certain, however, that knowledge about such entities and questions could be attained by recourse to experienceable phenomena. أنا بفكر في حاجة. هو دلوقتي ساعدتني التفكير ذهني. الكتاب عبارة عن الجزء الثالث والرابع والخامس. لا يبدو مهمين. يبدو ان الثلاث فصول دول بس هما المهمين التي تتحدث عن الأشاعرة. فأنا هعمل join PDF، اعمل merge يعني ادمج الPDFات بتاع إيروين وحسن سبيفاك. بعد كده احولها من PDF لوورد وابدأ اغير فيها او الخصها يعني. الله، انا متفائل بس قلقان في نفس الوقت. عايز اعمل حاجة حلوة، عايز اكتب حاجة حلوة بس يعني عايز اعمل حاجة حلوة ولكن انا جاهل بنظرية المعرفة يعني الإسلامية. عندي فكرة يعني مش جاهل 100%. أنا عندي فكرة بس هل الفكرة دي كافية؟ لا طبعا. هناك 3 مصادر أساسية للمعرفة الإسلامية: الحس والعقل والنقل، أو ما يعرف أيضا بدل كلمة النقل ليها أسماء كتير: النقل، السمع، الشهادة، الوحي. لا الوحي لا، معذرة مش الوحي. يعني هي كلمة النقل أكتر كلمة مناسبة يعني في نظري. نعدل بقى. أول حاجة نخليها كله تايمز نيو رومان، نخلي كله 12، نخلي كله justified، نخلي كله 1.5، نخلي كله normal، نخلي كله portrait، نخلي كله A4، نخلي كله 0 0 0 0. كده كام صفحة؟ خلينا نفتح ده على الجنب كده ونحط على الجنب الآخر الملف الأصلي اللي أنا لسه قافله بذكائي. نمسح ده كله. شابتر 4 ما بحبش كله يبقى كابيتال كده، خليها كده كابيتال صغير. شابتر 4 how to know debating sense experience in classical كلام by Hannah C. Erlewine. Introduction. نخلي ده مسود كده. كيف نعلم؟ ممكن نخليه وسطي بدل ما هو كده قصير، يعني ممكن نخليه وسطي كده. debating class experience in classical كلام هانا إيروين. حلو كده. الآن much of what Islamic theology was concerned with were entities that the theologians thought were removed from direct experience. Theologians also discussed a number of questions which could not be decided based on direct sense experience, such as whether the world has entered existence at some point in the past or has always existed. Theologians were certain, however, that knowledge about such entities and questions could be attained by recourse to experiential phenomena. That is, theologians were certain, however, that knowledge about such entities and questions could be attained by recourse to experienceable phenomena, that is, by turning to the world around us. هذا الهامش This is illustrated best, one might say, in their use of analogical reasoning between the shahid the domain of experienceable phenomena and the domain of phenomena that are not accessible by sense experience. بعد كده هامش. ما هو هذا الهامش؟ I translate شاهد مش تمام. ثانية واحدة أروح الحمام. هالو، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. عدنا إليكم بعد انقطاع طويل. عدنا إليكم جسمانيا، ولكن يعني عقليا أنا لسه يعني مش عايز أذاكر. ف مش عارف بقى ما العمل. أنا زهقان. الله، لا إله إلا الله، حسبنا الله، لا إله إلا هو، عليه توكلت وهو رب العرش العظيم. الله الله الله، لا إله إلا الله. حسنا، هيا بنا نبدأ. This is illustrated best, one might want to say, in the use of analogical reasoning between the domain of experiential phenomena and the domain of phenomena that are not accessible by sense experience. This form of analogical reasoning was known among theologians by names such as الاستشهاد بالشاهد على الغائب، دلالة الشاهد على الغائب، or رد الغائب إلى الشاهد. طيب، هذه الجزئية غير مهمة أظن يعني. The idea was that certain experiences of the world became relevant for the science of Kalam. They were, as it were, turned into scientific objects, to use contemporary parlance. يعني insofar as theologians could use them to attain knowledge about unexperienceable phenomena, since the phenomena in the two domains were thought to have something in common that allowed for the transfer of judgment from the shahid to the ghaib. Explain, my friend, explain. We need a ChatGPT for this question. Let's go. Allah. Explain, please. Meanwhile, I play. الله. ماذا تفعلون أيها الطيور؟ الطيور تطير. عجبا. الطيور تطير. أيوة. The idea was that certain experiences of the world became relevant to the science of Kalam. These observable experiences were used as a basis for reasoning about realities that could not be directly experienced. For instance, by observing causation in the natural world, theologians could build arguments about divine causation, creation, or God's continuous control of the world. أظن الحل إن احنا نرجع إلى إيدا ستون biographies دي. بسم الله. قبل ما يفتح دعونا نرجع للكلام. يفتح دلوقتي، ننتظر بقى. فتح. مش عايز اذاكر. سأترك الهاتف، سأترك اللعب وأرجع إلى المشي. أنا عايز أقرأ المقدمة مفيش نتيجة، مفيش ملخص. طيب نقرأ المقدمة، بعد كده نطلب من شات جي بي تي يلخص الفصول. بس أنا يعني مش هقرأ، أنا هسمع. ليس عندي تحفيز لكي أقرأ.
Lorraine Daston. Introduction. The coming into being of scientific objects. Of scientific objects. This is a book about applied metaphysics. It is about how whole domains of phenomena, dreams, atoms, monsters, culture, mortality, centers of gravity, value, cytoplasmic particles, the self, tuberculosis come into being and pass away as objects of scientific inquiry. The echo to the title of Aristotle's treatise on generation and corruption is deliberate. This is a sublunary metaphysics of change, of the perpetuity of coming to be. If pure metaphysics treats the ethereal world of what is always and everywhere from a God's eye viewpoint, then applied metaphysics studies the dynamic world of what emerges and disappears. If pure metaphysics treats the ethereal world of what is always and everywhere from a God's eye viewpoint, then applied metaphysics studies the dynamic world of what emerges and disappears from the horizon of working scientists. But the contrast between pure and applied metaphysics is not necessarily just a reformulation of that between ontology and epistemology, between what is really real and what is dimly known, noumena and phenomena. Applied metaphysics assumes that reality is a matter of degree, and that phenomena that are indisputably real in the colloquial sense that they. Applied metaphysics assumes that reality is a matter of degree, and that phenomena that are indisputably real in the colloquial sense that they exist may become more or less intensely real, depending on how densely they are woven into scientific thought and practice, and that phenomena that are indisputably real in the colloquial sense that they exist may become more or less intensely real, depending. Applied metaphysics assumes that reality is a matter of degree, and that phenomena that are indisputably real in the colloquial sense that they exist may become more or less intensely real, depending on how densely they are woven into scientific thought and practice. Monsters, for example, we have always had with us, but only sporadically have they attracted the probing curiosity of anatomists, challenged the natural kinds of taxonomists, furnished crucial experiments for embryologists, filled out the collections of naturalists, in short, come into being as scientific objects. This way of understanding scientific objects cuts against the grain of assumptions that inform much if not most literature in the history, philosophy, and sociology of science. It is also at odds with the sense entrenched in. Hence it may be the etymology of the very word object in several major European languages. Hence it may be of use first to lay out the prevailing assumptions as clearly as possible, and then to explain.
أنا مش فاهم. يبدو ان احنا لازم نقرا. ايه study and learn دي؟ ايه agent mode دي؟ كويس. بيحمل. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. حاسس ان انا فهمت يعني نوعا ما. ماشي، عقبال ما يحمل. تعالوا نرجع لموضوعنا. idea that certain experiences of the world became relevant to the size of Canaan.
Summary of Biographies of Scientific Objects, ed. Lorraine Daston, 2000. This volume is a collective exploration of how scientific objects, dreams, monsters, ether, value, cytoplasmic society, and many more, emerge, evolve, and sometimes vanish within the history of science. Rather than treating objects as timeless discoveries, the essays argue that they have biographies. They come into being, gain salience, and may disappear, depending on shifting epistemic, cultural, and institutional contexts. Number 1. Introduction, Applied Metaphysics. Lorraine Daston frames the project as an applied metaphysics, investigating how phenomena are transformed into scientific objects. Scientific objects differ from ordinary ones in that they must be stabilized, classified, and embedded in research practices. This rejects the simple dichotomy between realism, objects as discovered and eternal, and constructionism, objects as invented and cultural. Instead, the essays demonstrate that scientific objects can be simultaneously real and historical. Hash number 2, 4 approaches to scientific objects. Daston identifies 4 analytic perspectives that run across the essays. Salience. When familiar phenomena, dreams, mortality, the moi, suddenly attract intense attention and become scientific objects. Emergence. When entirely new categories are created, such as society in the 19th century or mathematical entities like symbolic numbers. Productivity. When objects prove their reality by generating new knowledge, experiments, or applications, e.g., value theories in economics, cytoplasmic particles in molecular biology. Embeddedness. When the survival of an object depends on its material, institutional, and technical networks, e.g., the Koch bacillus persisting only through labs, microscopes, and diagnostic practices. Out of 3. Case studies. Preternatural philosophy, Daston, 16th, 17th century fascination with anomalies, monsters, comets, marvels, as central to natural philosophy, later dissolving into fragmented subfields. Mathematical entities, Feldhay. Jesuit Paulus Golden reconceived mathematics as dealing with indeterminate magnitudes and centers of gravity, reshaping debates on Copernicanism and divine knowledge. Dreams and self-consciousness, Kaufmann. In late Enlightenment Germany, dreams became moral scientific objects tied to anxieties about self-control. Mutations of the self, Goldstein. The rise of the moi in post-revolutionary France as a psychological object with political and social implications. Value theories, Jorland. Theories of value structured economics for 2 centuries before disappearing, showing how productive but ultimately unstable objects can fade. Society, Wagner. Society. Itself emerged around 1800 as a novel scientific object distinct from state or household. Culture, Solons. Culture is never dying out. Rather, it constantly renews itself in new forms, showing the protean endurance of scientific objects. Ether and the microworld, Buchwald. The ether, though later discarded, generated
It is certainly not a coincidence that theologians named the domain of research al-Shahad, which is derived from the Shahada, to bear witness, to testify to something. Thus, experiential phenomena bear witness to actions. They are an indication pointing beyond themselves to what is absent or hidden, and at the same time they become a proof in the hands of theologians. Thus we read al-Shahid Dalil al-Ghaib. This view of the role of experiential phenomena in Kalam Islamic theology reflects the conviction already held by the earliest generations of theologians that the purpose of their science was to place religious dogmas on a rational foundation. Many theologians insisted in the opening chapters of their works that speculation was the first, or in case the first obligation imposed by God on humans, and that this was so as blind following, of authorities in religious questions was unacceptable. Blind following entails, they held, acceptance of someone's position in the absence of proof. Yet one needed good reason to follow one person rather than another, and good reasons meant proof of the truth of what they claimed. Proof would lead to knowledge and do away with mere conviction and supposition. The most fundamental religious dogmas therefore needed to be subjected to speculation and investigation on the basis of rational arguments. This claim defined Islamic theology from the beginning, and it marked the line between the camp of the